Hello and welcome back to the 100 JavaScript Beginner Project series. So in this project, we'll be building a JavaScript tip calculator to calculate a tip that maybe you might want to give the waiter, and that'd be based upon the quality of your service. So the JavaScript topics in this project include variables, document.getElementById, arithmetic operators, utilizing the toFix function, and as per normal, utilizing Bootstrap framework. And here we'll be integrating the Bootstrap modal and having a look at how JavaScript can control how that appears and disappears. Okay, right. So first up, let's have a look at the actual end product here. So we enter the cost of the meal, say maybe it was £100, and then you're not too sure what tip to give the waiter. So maybe you just had, you had fantastic service today. So you want to give a 10% tip to the waiter or waitress. And then how many people are with you today? Just on your own, it's just your lunch break. And then you press submit, and there we go. So you need to give the waiter £10 if you want to give 10% tip. Okay, so let's start off by integrating Bootstrap so that we can get the visuals in place. So Bootstrap, getbootstrap.com documentation, we're just going to utilize the starter template. So I copy that, go back into my code, and there we go. So in this case, we're not going to need the JavaScript here. Oh, we are going to need that. In fact, we're going to be utilizing the Bootstrap modal. So we are going to need that. Apologies. So let's get rid of line 14. We're not going to need that. And then obviously we'll just name our project JavaScript tip calc. And there we go. So that's the first step. Okay, so next step, we're going to create a new container here, this div, and then we've got the class container. So let's just remember that we're using Bootstrap here. So we're avoiding utilizing or developing any CSS. We're going to use all the tools built into Bootstrap. So container, so that is a class that's already been generated in Bootstrap. Remember that up here, we're linking to the Bootstrap CSS. So we're just utilizing all the CSS that comes with Bootstrap. We're going to be having a dark background in our box that we create. So we're using text light, which is going to create the text is going to go white or lighter. And then we're using the margin top 5 to give a little bit of a spacing at the top of the page. So these are all classes in Bootstrap, which you can research. So let's go ahead now and create our row. Okay, so I make a new set of divs here, and I've got now, this is a new row, and we're justifying the content in the center. So this is going to make anything in between or the next element or child elements here justify in the center of the page. Because you remember from the example had the box in the middle of the page. Okay, next up, I create a new div here, and this is going to be a width of 5, so co-MD5. So if you change that to 4, the width of your box will be smaller. If you change it up all the way up to a 12, that'll make a larger box. So the background color is going to be dark. Remember, we've got text light. So we've got a light colored text, and then we've got the background dark. And again, these are just all Bootstrap classes that can be changed. So we could have background dark and light and so on. And then P for padding, that's going to be 3. So there's going to be padding all the way around the box of 3. So you can see what 3 means again in Bootstrap documentation. That equals around about 25 pixels. So we've gone ahead now and created a heading. We centered the text in the middle, and this is going to be called JavaScript tip calculator. So let's have a look to see what we built so far. And there we have it. So now we need to build the form. So building a form, again, we're going to be utilizing Bootstrap. Let's remember this. So we create a new form tag or element, form, start and close. Give it an ID of form, which is going to be utilized later to hook into with the JavaScript or to bind, sorry. And then we've created a new div. So with Bootstrap, we use a div element, and then we have class equals form group. So for every input field section of your form, you're going to use a new div section or div element with the class form group. And here we're creating a simple form by creating a label. So we're utilizing a label, and we're binding the label to the input using the for. So the for represents the ID here, or binds to this ID, so that when we click on the label, it then puts the cursor in the input box. And then we create an input. So this is the first input. It's going to be text. And this is where they're going to type, or the user is going to type the total cost. And we add a placeholder total. So that's going to appear in the input field when we initially load the page. So let's just save that and see what that looks like. There we go. So that's that done. And like I said, we bound with for an ID this here. So when I click on cost, you can see the cursor appears in there. Okay, so next thing is we just need to make two more inputs. So here they are. These are the next two inputs. So the first input here, this is going to be a drop-down box. So again, we've used the div element here, class form group. This is a new form group. We've got our label, which is going to be service quality. We make sure that we bind the label using the for and the ID service. It's the same name, service. And then we've used a select. So we've got select here and we've got three options. Notice that I put the values here. So this is what the values are that represents when someone selects one of these options. In addition to that, I've utilized some other code here. You might not be familiar with this type of format. These are just HTML character references. So for example, at #37, let's see what that is. If I just refresh, if I save and then refresh, you can see it's the percentage character. Okay, so we've got the options, and then we created a final form group here. This is for the number of people, to input the number of people. And again, it's just text. We make sure that we bind the for and the ID, and then we've got a placeholder of people. Okay, so then we create a button at the end so that we can submit. So button, type button, value submit, ID is tip calc. And then we've got a class here. So this is the Bootstrap class that creates the style for this button. And then inside it just says submit. So that's the button. So that completes the HTML. And obviously we don't need CSS in this case because we're just hooking into the Bootstrap CSS. And if we go back and look at this form, you can now see we've got the completed form. So on to the JavaScript. So here we created a set of script tags. And then inside you can see that we started typing some JavaScript. So the first thing that we need to do is to capture when someone presses the button. We want to capture the fact that someone has pressed the button. So let's do that by utilizing this document, get element by ID, so tip calc. So we find the element tip count. You can see here that we've got the element ID tip count, so that matches up. And then we have an on-click function, so .onClick. And when someone clicks that button, we want it to do something. And in this case, we're going to create a new function. And that function that then people are passed to is a function called calculate tip. So by clicking on the button here, that's going to basically send the user to a new function that we're going to build called calculate tip. So first of all, we need to collect 3 items from the form. We need to collect the total cost that someone's entered, the service that they received, and then also how many people. So the total cost is obviously going to be the number that someone's typed in. Total cost, £100, $100. And then the service value, that's going to be generated from these numbers here, these values. So what's going to appear in that variable there are one of these values here based on what someone selected. Thirdly, this variable here is going to store whatever someone's typed into the people input field. So these are 3 variables that's going to store. These 3 variables here are going to store that information. And now we can extract this information from these variables and make some calculations. Now, before we make any calculations, it's probably a good idea to validate the input. So there are many ways that we can do this. We could utilize HTML5, for example, but this is an example with JavaScript. So this is a really simple example of input validation here. So if the total cost, so if this variable here, remember this variable has been captured by the form where someone's typed in something or not. So if someone hasn't typed in something into the total cost input form, then total cost is going to equal nothing at all. So therefore, an alert is going to appear on the screen and say, hey, you forgot the total cost. And it's not then going to allow the user to go any further in this system. So let's just see that in place. So here we are, and we're not going to type anything into the total. We're going to keep this 10% and number of people 1, press submit, and there we go. Hey, you forgot the total cost. Okay, so you can't submit until you type in the total cost. And then now we need to make the calculations. So we build a variable to hold the total after the calculation called total. And now we make the calculation. So it's total cost, this is in brackets, times the service. So we do that first, and then we divide it by the amount of people that were at the meal. So that creates the initial calculation and is stored then in the variable total. So now we want to store our output into two decimal places. So we take the total and then we create then we define what's inside total. So the variable total is now going to equal the total dot to fixed 2. So this function here is basically going to take the number that's stored in total and it's going to fix it to 2 decimal places. Why do we do that? Well, in the UK here, we have pence and pounds. So we have £1.50, for example. So we have 2 decimal places. So in order to generate 2 decimal places for the pence in the money terms, we use fixed to fix that to 2 decimal places. So that's going to generate a good answer or an appropriate amount of money to tip the user. So now we have the total tip, we can now display the tip on the web page. So we're going to be utilizing a Bootstrap Modal here. So let's just set this up and come back to this script here. So if you head back over to the Bootstrap documentation and then look in the components, you'll find a modal option here. And we're going to utilize this modal here. So we're just going to copy some code. We're going to use the live demo here. So we'll copy that code. So we pasted the code into our project just above the JavaScript and below the other form that we created, the other element, we created. So let's just see that in action now. There we go. So that's what's going to happen. So obviously we've got this button here that then produces this modal, and we want to put the actual outcome of our calculation, our tip calculation in here. So those are the 2 tasks that we need to perform. So let's do that next. So first of all, let's just get rid of this button because we're not going to use the button here. So we'll just get rid of that comment. Okay. Too much. Okay, so now what we need to do is collect the information from our total and to put it into this section here. So it appears in the modal. So I've just created some simple code here. In a p tag, the tipped today is, and then the space, and then I've used a span, which I've then included a pound icon or the pound sign. And then we've got span ID tooltip. And then right here is where we're going to inject the actual total tip amount. And then each at the end here, the word each. So we need to identify or capture this span here with ID tooltip. And then we need to insert the total tip number right there. So going back to the bottom of our JavaScript, we've got document.getElementById. Remember, it was total tooltip. And then inside of there, we want to put some text, which is the total. So this variable total. So remember, we started here, we calculated the total based upon the inputs. We then fixed it to 2 decimal points. And now we're using that variable to output onto the screen. And we want to put that inside of the element tooltip with the ID tooltip. So That's going to display the total. And then in order for us now to utilize the modal, we've basically identifying the modal. So it should be example modal. So back up here, if we go into our modal, it should be called example modal. Yep. So we're identifying it by ID. And what we're saying now is that we want to toggle it. So dot modal and then toggle, and that will open up the modal. So when we press the button, all this calculation will happen. The total will then be placed in the total tip section, and then the modal will open. And that really just finalizes this really simple example. So let's just see that all now in action. If I refresh, so the total is 100. We're going to give them 10% again, number of people 1, press submit, and there we go. So there we have it. We've built a JavaScript tip calculator to calculate what tip you should give to a waiter after a meal. So we've looked at, or we've utilized variables, the document.getElement by ID. We've had a look at we've utilized some arithmetic operators and the toFix function. And then we've also incorporated a Bootstrap framework from the Bootstrap framework, the modal, and controlled it with a little bit of JavaScript.